The most dangerous thing in a room full of powerful men is silence. I didn't understand that until the night everything changed. My shift was supposed to end at 10 o'clock p.m. Just another long Friday at a downtown restaurant where tips meant rent and smiles were part of the uniform. But by 10:37, I was still there, balancing a tray of untouched drinks, wondering why table 12 hadn't ordered a single thing in over 20 minutes. Something felt off. Not loud, not obvious, just wrong. The kind of wrong that settles into your chest before your brain catches up. Four men in tailored suits sat around the table, but they weren't eating, weren't talking much either, just exchanging quiet glances that said more than words ever could. And every time I walked by, I felt it, like stepping into cold air from a warm room. Then the door opened. No announcement, no noise, but everything shifted. Conversations didn't stop. They softened, bent around him like he controlled the space without trying. I didn't need anyone to tell me who he was. Adrian Voss. I'd heard the name before in whispers between coworkers, in warnings that came with lowered voices and careful eyes. Don't stare. Don't get involved. Don't ask questions. He moved through the restaurant like he belonged to a different world, one where rules didn't apply the same way, where power wasn't shown, it was understood. He sat down at table 12, and no one greeted him. No handshake, no smile, just silence. That was the second time my chest tightened. The first had been instinct. This was recognition. Something wasn't right. I slowed down as I approached, pretending to check the glasses, but really I was watching. One man's hand rested too close to his jacket. Another shifted in his seat like he was waiting for a cue. No one touched their drinks. Not one sip. My heart started pounding. Loud enough, I thought someone might hear it over the low hum of music and conversation, and suddenly I knew. I didn't know how. I didn't know why. But I knew. This wasn't a meeting. This was a moment waiting to happen. Not my business, I told myself. Walk away. Go back to the kitchen. Clock out. Forget this table ever existed. My feet didn't move. I took one step closer instead, then another, until I was standing beside him, close enough to smell the faint trace of something expensive and sharp, close enough to feel the stillness around him like gravity. My hand didn't shake when I reached for his glass. I don't know how. Maybe fear does that. Turns everything steady right before it breaks. I leaned down just enough, my voice barely more than breath. Don't stand up, I whispered. They're waiting. For a second, nothing happened. No reaction. No movement. I thought maybe I'd made a mistake. Then I saw it. The smallest shift. His fingers, resting on the table, moved half an inch. And suddenly, the silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like something about to unfold. He did not look at me. Not immediately. And that somehow made it worse, because it meant he had heard me and chosen not to react, at least not in a way anyone else could see. And for a second, I thought maybe I had just made the biggest mistake of my life. Maybe I had stepped into something far beyond my understanding, something that would swallow me whole before I even realized it had begun. But then I noticed the shift again, subtle, controlled, like everything about him. His posture did not change. His expression remained calm, almost bored, but his attention, it moved. Not outward, not obvious, just enough that I could feel it, like a current under still water, and suddenly the room felt smaller, tighter, like the walls were leaning in to listen. I straightened slowly, forcing myself to breathe normally, to move like nothing had happened, like I was just another waitress doing her job, but my pulse would not slow down. It hammered in my ears, loud and relentless. And I could not stop noticing the details now, the things I had almost ignored before. The man to Adrian's left adjusted his cuff, but his eyes never left Adrian's hands. The one across from him tapped his fingers once against the table, then stopped, like he had remembered something at the last second, and the man closest to the window shifted his chair by half an inch. Not enough for anyone to question, but enough to change his angle, enough to see more, or maybe to act faster. I swallowed. My throat dry, my fingers tightening around the tray as I stepped back, each movement deliberate, careful, like I was walking a tightrope I could not see. And still, no one touched their drinks. The glasses sat there, untouched, reflecting the dim lights above, like props in a scene that had not started yet, or maybe one that had already been decided. I turned toward the kitchen, telling myself this was it. This was where I left. Where I forgot. Where I pretended I had never leaned down and whispered into a stranger's world. But before I could take more than 2 steps, a chair moved, soft, controlled, the kind of sound most people would not notice. But I did, because everything in me was already on edge. I stopped without meaning to, my body reacting before my mind could catch up, and I felt it, the shift in the air, like a breath being held across the entire room. I did not turn around right away. I could not without making it obvious, not without drawing attention I did not want. So I stood there for half a second too long, my back to them, my heart racing. And then I heard his voice, low, even, completely unaffected. "You should not be standing here," he said. And for a moment I thought he was talking to me, my stomach dropping, my grip tightening on the tray. But then I realized his voice was directed at someone else, one of the men at the table. And that was when I turned, slowly, carefully. Like I had every right to be there, like I belonged in this moment as much as anyone else. And what I saw did not look like chaos, did not look like danger in the way movies showed it. There were no raised voices, no sudden movements, just tension, thick and invisible, stretching between them like a wire pulled too tight. Adrian had not stood up, not like they had expected. Instead, he remained seated, relaxed, almost casual. But his eyes, they were different now, sharp, aware, focused in a way that made it clear he was no longer just part of the room. He controlled it, and the man he had spoken to hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. But it was enough for something to break, not loudly, not dramatically, just a shift in control, like a game where one player suddenly realized they were no longer winning. I could feel it. Even from where I stood, the balance had changed, whatever they had planned. Whatever timing they had counted on, it was gone now, replaced by something else, something they had not prepared for. And I knew, with a certainty that made my chest tighten, that it had started the moment I leaned down and whispered into his ear. I had stepped into their world, and now there was no stepping back. No one raised their voice. And that was the part that unsettled me the most, because everything important was happening in the spaces between words, in the pauses, in the way one man's fingers curled slightly against the table, as if reconsidering something he could not undo. And I could feel it building, not like an explosion, but like pressure, slow and precise, the kind that does not release unless someone decides it is time. And somehow, impossibly, that decision no longer belonged to them. It belonged to him. Adrian leaned back just enough to look comfortable, as if this was exactly how he had expected the night to go, as if nothing about this moment surprised him anymore. And maybe it did not. Maybe my whisper had not warned him. Maybe it had only confirmed what he already suspected, and that thought made my stomach twist, because if that was true, then I had not saved him. I had simply stepped into a game that had already begun long before I arrived. The man across from him cleared his throat, a small sound, but it cut through the silence like something louder. "We should proceed," he said, his voice controlled, careful, but there was something under it now, something tight, something uncertain, and Adrian's gaze lifted slowly, meeting his without hurry, without pressure, just a quiet kind of attention that seemed to pull the truth out of the air. "You already tried," Adrian replied, his tone even, almost conversational, and for a second, no one moved. The words hung there, simple, but heavy, like they meant more than they said, and I realized I was still standing too close, still within reach of something I did not understand, and every instinct I had told me to leave, to step away before anyone noticed me, before I became part of whatever this was turning into. But my feet would not cooperate, not yet. Not when everything inside me was trying to understand how a single sentence had shifted the entire room. The man near the window shifted again, this time more noticeably, like he had run out of patience or options. His eyes flicked toward the others, searching, asking a question without words. And for the first time since Adrian had entered, I saw it clearly, the cracks, the hesitation, the realization that whatever plan they had built depended on a moment that no longer existed. Adrian's hand rested lightly on the table. His fingers relaxed, but there was something deliberate about it, something that suggested control rather than ease. And when he spoke again, his voice dropped just enough that it forced everyone to listen. "You should have chosen a different night," he said, and I felt the words more than I heard them, because they carried something final, something that closed doors rather than opened them. The man to his left let out a slow breath, barely audible, and leaned back in his chair, as if surrendering to something he could not fight. and the others followed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but one by one. Small movements that added up to a single outcome. The tension did not disappear. It changed, shifted into something quieter, something resolved, and I stood there, frozen in the middle of it, trying to understand how it had happened so quickly, how a moment that felt like it could break everything had instead folded in on itself, contained, controlled, decided without a single raised voice. And then Adrian moved, not abruptly, not with urgency. Just a simple motion as he reached for the glass in front of him, the one no one had touched all night, and lifted it slightly, studying the reflection of the light against the surface as if it held an answer only he could see. And then, finally, he looked at me, not past me, not through me, at me, and I felt it instantly, the shift in focus. The weight of his attention settling in a way that made everything else fade into the background. My breath caught, my grip tightening on the tray as I realized, too late, that leaving now would not make me invisible, not after what I had done, not after the words I had whispered. His gaze did not feel angry. It did not feel grateful either. It felt curious, measured, like he was trying to place me into a world where I did not belong. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter than before, but somehow more direct. "Stay," he said. And it was not a request. It was not a command spoken loudly. It was something in between, something that assumed I would listen without needing to force me. And I did not understand why. I did not understand what he wanted or what came next, but my feet did not move, not away, not toward, just still, caught in the moment I had created, knowing, without anyone saying it out loud, that whatever happened next would not just involve him anymore. It would involve me. My fingers tightened around the tray until the edges pressed into my palms, grounding me in a way nothing else could, because leaving was no longer an option, not after he said that single word, not after every pair of eyes at the table had shifted, just slightly, just enough to mark me as something different than before, not just staff, not just background, something seen, something noted, and I hated how quickly everything had changed, how one decision had pulled me into a space I did not belong in, but I stayed, because moving now would only make it worse, because something in his voice had made it clear that walking away would not make me free, it would only make me noticed in the wrong way, and I could not afford that, not tonight, not ever. So I stood there, forcing my breathing to stay even, forcing my expression to remain neutral, like I had done this 1,000 times before. Like I belonged in rooms where silence meant more than words. Adrian set the glass back down without drinking, his gaze still on me, not heavy, not aggressive, just present, and that somehow made it harder to ignore, because there was no obvious threat, no raised tone, just quiet attention that felt deliberate, like he was measuring something I could not see. "What is your name?" he asked, and the question was simple, almost casual, but nothing about this moment felt casual. Not with the way the others had gone still again, not with the way the entire table seemed to wait for my answer like it mattered more than it should. My throat felt dry, but I spoke anyway. "Lily," I said, keeping my voice steady, keeping it soft, like it belonged in this room, like it would not draw attention from the rest of the restaurant that carried on around us, as if none of this was happening, as if this table did not exist in a different world layered over the same space. "Lily," he repeated, not questioning, not reacting, just confirming, like a detail being placed where it belonged. And then his attention shifted, not away, but wider, encompassing the others again, and the air changed with it, the quiet resolution from moments before settling into something more final, more defined. "We are done here," he said, and this time it was unmistakable, not loud, not forceful, but absolute, the kind of statement that did not need to be repeated, and one by one, the men at the table responded, not with arguments, not with resistance, just small acknowledgments, a nod, a shift, a glance exchange that said everything had already been decided. Whatever had been planned for this night was over, not postponed, not delayed, ended, and I felt a strange kind of relief mixed with something else, something heavier, because I knew, without understanding how, that the end of their plan was not the end of my involvement, not after I had stepped in, not after he had noticed me. The men began to stand, chairs moving softly against the floor, controlled, careful, like everything else about them, and none of them looked at me directly, but I could feel it, the awareness, the quiet acknowledgement that I had been part of something I should not have been, and that knowledge settled in my chest like a weight I could not shake. Adrian remained seated a moment longer, watching them go, not with suspicion, not with concern, just with a calm certainty that made it clear he was not worried about what came next, because he had already accounted for it. And when the last of them stepped away from the table, blending back into the normal rhythm of the restaurant, the tension that had filled the space did not disappear. It narrowed, focused, until it was just him and me, standing across from each other in a moment that felt quieter but somehow more intense than everything that had come before. He finally reached for his glass again, lifting it slightly before setting it back down once more. Untouched, like a habit he did not need to complete. And then he stood, slow, controlled, the movement deliberate in a way that made my breath catch for reasons I could not fully explain, because I remembered what I had said, what I had warned him about. And yet here he was, standing, unhurried, unaffected, like the danger I had sensed no longer existed, or maybe never had for him in the way it had for me. He stepped around the table, closing the distance between us without rushing, without hesitation, and stopped just close enough that I could feel the shift again, that quiet gravity that seemed to follow him wherever he went. "You should not have done that," he said, and there was no anger in his voice, no accusation, just a statement, calm and certain, and I swallowed, my grip loosening slightly on the tray as I found my voice again. "I know," I admitted, because there was no point pretending otherwise. No point denying what had already been seen, and for a second, he just looked at me, really looked, like he was deciding something I could not hear, something that would matter more than anything I could say. And then, just as quietly as everything else had happened, he spoke again. "Then why did you?" And that question, simple as it was, felt heavier than anything else that night, because I did not have a good answer, not one that made sense in his world, not one that explained why someone like me would step into something like that without thinking about the cost. But I answered anyway, because something in me refused to stay silent now, because no one else did. I said, and the words hung between us, small, honest, and completely out of place in a world built on silence and control. And for the first time since he had walked in, something in his expression shifted. Not much, not enough for anyone else to notice, but I saw it, because I was looking for it, because I had already stepped too far to pretend I was not part of this anymore. And in that moment, I realized that whatever I had done had not just changed his night, it had changed mine in a way I could not take back. For a moment, neither of us spoke, and the silence between us felt different now, no longer stretched thin with tension, but settled, deliberate, like something had been decided without being said out loud. And I could not tell if that made it better or worse, because at least before, I understood the danger. It was in the room, in the men, in the quiet threat hanging over everything. But now it was here, focused, narrowed down to a single person standing in front of me, watching me like I was. Something unexpected, something that did not fit into whatever pattern he was used to. And that uncertainty made my chest tighten in a way I could not ignore. I shifted my weight slightly, the tray still in my hands, a reminder that I was supposed to be somewhere else, doing something normal, something safe. But that version of the night felt very far away now, like it belonged to someone else entirely. Adrian did not move immediately, his gaze steady, thoughtful, like he was turning my answer over in his mind, testing it for something more, something hidden. But there was nothing else there. No strategy, no deeper meaning, just the truth, simple and inconvenient. And I wondered if that was what made it stand out to him. Because in a room like this, honesty did not belong. It did not survive long enough to matter. No one else did. He repeated quietly, not mocking, not dismissing, just acknowledging it like it was a fact he had not expected to hear. And then his expression shifted again, subtle, but real, like something had clicked into place. Something that made sense in a way the rest of the night had not. He glanced toward the empty table behind him, the untouched glasses, the chairs that had been filled with quiet intention only minutes ago, and then back at me, and I felt it again, that weight of attention, sharper now, more focused. Like he had moved past curiosity into something else, something more deliberate. "You saw it before I did," he said, and it was not a question, it was a conclusion, one that made my breath catch slightly, because I had not thought of it that way, had not considered that what I felt, that instinct, had actually mattered in a way that could change anything. I shook my head slightly, instinctively. I did not know what it was, I admitted, my voice quieter now, more careful, because I could feel the shift in the conversation, the way it was moving somewhere I could not predict. I just knew something was wrong. And that was the truth, the only truth I had to offer. And for a second, I thought maybe that would be the end of it. Maybe he would nod, accept it, and walk away, leaving me with nothing but a story I would never tell. But he did not move, did not step back into whatever world he had come from. Instead, he stayed, right there, close enough that I could not pretend this was over. Most people feel that, he said, his voice even, controlled. They just choose to ignore it. And something about the way he said it made it clear that he was not just talking about tonight, not just about the men at that table, but about something bigger, something that stretched beyond this room, beyond this moment. And I did not know how to respond to that, did not know what someone like me was supposed to say to someone like him when the conversation turned into something deeper than survival. So I said nothing, and somehow, that felt like the right choice, because he did not seem to expect an answer, not this time. Instead, he reached into his jacket slowly, deliberately, and for a split second, my body tensed without permission, a reflex I could not control. But he only pulled out a card, simple, clean, nothing flashy, and placed it gently on the edge of the table between us. "If you ever feel something is wrong again," he said, his eyes meeting mine once more, steady. "Certain, you call that number." And I stared at the card for a moment, not reaching for it. Not yet, because the meaning behind it felt heavier than the object itself. This was not a tip, not a gesture of appreciation. It was something else entirely, something that connected me to him in a way I had not agreed to, in a way I was not sure I wanted, and I hesitated, my fingers tightening slightly around the tray again, because taking it would mean acknowledging that connection, accepting that whatever had started tonight was not ending here, and he seemed to understand that hesitation, because he did not push, did not repeat himself. He simply waited, calm and patient, like he already knew what I would do, like the decision had already been made. And after a second that felt much longer than it should have, I reached out, slowly, carefully, and took the card, the edges smooth against my fingertips. Real in a way that made everything else feel even more surreal. And when I looked back up at him, his expression had settled into something unreadable again, the brief shift from before gone, replaced by that same controlled calm that had filled the room when he first walked in. "You changed the outcome tonight," he said quietly, and there was no exaggeration in his tone, no drama, just a statement of fact that landed heavier than anything else he had said. And before I could respond, before I could even process what that meant for me, for him, for whatever came next, he stepped back, just enough to create space between us again. And in that single step, the moment shifted once more, not ending, not closing, just moving forward into something I could not yet see, something I had already become a part of whether I wanted to or not. The card felt heavier than it should have, like the weight of it did not come from paper but from everything it represented, and I kept my fingers wrapped around it longer than necessary, as if letting go would make it more real, as if putting it away would mean accepting something I was not ready to name. Adrian had already stepped back, already creating distance, but the space between us did not feel like separation. It felt like something held open, something unfinished, and I stood there, for a second too long again, trying to catch up to a moment that had already moved past me. The restaurant noise slowly returned around us, glasses clinking, quiet conversations resuming, footsteps crossing polished floors like nothing had happened, like the past 10 minutes had not shifted something fundamental in the air. And that contrast made it harder to breathe, harder to understand how two realities could exist in the same place at the same time. I glanced down at the card in my hand. Simple, clean, a name, a number, nothing else, no explanation, no instructions, just a line that connected me to a world I had only ever heard about in fragments and warnings, and I should have put it in my pocket, should have hidden it away and gone back to work. But I did not move, not yet, because I could still feel his presence, even as he turned slightly, even as his attention shifted toward the exit like the night had already moved on for him. "You do not look like someone who makes impulsive decisions," he said, and I looked up, surprised that he was still speaking, that the conversation had not ended the moment he stepped back. His tone was not critical, not even questioning, just observant, like he was stating something he had already concluded, and I let out a small breath I had not realized I was holding. "I do not," I answered honestly, because there was no point pretending otherwise now. Not after everything. Not after I had already crossed whatever line existed between his world and mine, and that seemed to interest him more than anything else I had said, his gaze narrowing slightly, not in suspicion, but in focus, like he was trying to understand how someone who avoided risk had still chosen to take one at the exact moment it mattered most. "Then tonight was an exception," he said, and again, not a question. And I hesitated, because the answer felt more complicated than that, because it was not a decision I had thought through, not something I had planned or weighed against consequences. It had just happened, instinct over logic, feeling over reason, and I struggled to put that into words in a way that made sense in his world. "It did not feel like a choice," I said finally, my voice quieter now, more certain. "It felt like something I could not ignore," and the moment the words left my mouth, I knew they were true in a way I had not fully understood before. Because ignoring it would have meant walking away from something I could not unsee, something that would have stayed with me long after the night ended. And for a second, he just watched me again, that same measured silence settling between us. But this time it did not feel as heavy. It felt different, like something had shifted in his understanding, like he was seeing me not as an interruption, not as a complication, but as something else entirely, something that did not fit neatly into the categories he was used to. And that realization made my chest tighten in a different way, because I did not know what that meant for me, for what came next, for the way he would choose to respond to someone who did not belong in his world, but had stepped into it anyway. He glanced briefly toward the entrance, where one of the men from earlier now stood at a distance, not watching directly, but present enough to signal that whatever had happened tonight was not entirely over, just moved elsewhere. And then Adrian looked back at me, his expression settling into something calm again, controlled, like he had made a decision I was not part of, at least not yet. "Keep it," he said, nodding slightly toward the card in my hand. "Not because you might need it, but because one day, you will understand why you do." And something about the way he said it sent a quiet chill through me. Not fear, not exactly, but awareness. Like the moment I was standing in was not isolated, not contained to this night, but part of something larger I could not see yet. And before I could respond, before I could ask what he meant or why he sounded so certain, he turned fully this time, his attention shifting away from me without hesitation, without looking back, like the conversation had reached its natural end for him. And just like that, he stepped into the rhythm of the restaurant, blending into it in a way that did not make him invisible, but made him unreachable. Like a line had been drawn that I could not cross again unless he allowed it. And I stood there, the tray still in my hands, the card still between my fingers, watching him leave, knowing, without understanding how, that this was not the end of anything, that whatever had started tonight had only just begun. I did not move for a long time after he left, not because I could not, but because something in me refused to return to normal, like stepping back into my shift would erase what had just happened, and I knew it would not. I knew that no matter how many tables I served, no matter how many orders I carried back and forth, this night had already carved itself into something permanent, something I would not be able to forget even if I tried. The card rested against my palm, warm now from the pressure of my grip, and I finally slipped it into the small pocket of my apron, the motion slow, deliberate, like I was sealing something in place without fully understanding what it meant. "Lily," a voice called from across the room, sharp, familiar, and I turned instinctively. My manager standing near the bar with a look that meant I had been gone too long, that I had stepped out of line in a way that needed correcting. And for a second, the normal world rushed back in, orders, expectations. The quiet rules I knew how to follow. I nodded quickly and moved toward him, forcing my expression back into something neutral, something safe. "Where have you been?" he asked under his breath as I approached, not loud enough for customers to hear, but firm enough to remind me of my place. And I opened my mouth to answer, to give him something simple, something easy, but the words felt strange now, like they belonged to a version of me that had existed before this night. "Table 12 needed attention," I said instead, keeping it short, keeping it believable, and he glanced over my shoulder briefly, as if checking, as if confirming something he did not fully understand, then gave a small nod. Already moving on, already thinking about the next problem, the next order, the next detail that needed fixing, and just like that, I was back in motion, back in the rhythm I had known for years, carrying plates, refilling glasses, smiling when expected, speaking when necessary. But something was different now, something I could not ignore no matter how hard I tried to blend back in, because every time I passed that table, now empty, now just another part of the restaurant again, I felt it, the echo of what had happened there, the silence that had meant everything, the moment that had shifted without anyone else noticing, and I found myself looking toward the door more often than I should have, my eyes drifting there between tasks, between conversations, as if expecting something, or someone, to return, but he did not. The minutes stretched into hours, the night moving forward in the way it always did, slow at first, then suddenly over, the last customers leaving, chairs being stacked, lights dimmed just slightly as closing approached, and still, the weight of the card in my apron did not fade. If anything, it became more noticeable, like a quiet reminder that this was not just a strange moment I could forget, it was something that had followed me. Something I had chosen to carry even if I did not fully realize it at the time. By the time my shift ended, it was past midnight, the kind of late that made the city feel different, quieter, like everything had slowed down just enough to notice the details people usually ignored. I stepped outside into the cool air, the door closing behind me with a soft click that felt louder than it should have. And for a second, I just stood there, breathing in the night, letting the silence settle around me. In a way that felt almost familiar after everything that had happened inside, I reached into my apron pocket, pulling out the card again, turning it over between my fingers as if it might reveal something new, something I had missed before, but it was still the same, just a name, just a number, nothing else, no explanation, no context, and yet it felt like more than that, like a choice waiting to be made. Even if I did not know what that choice would lead to, a car passed slowly on the street, headlights washing over me for a brief moment before moving on, leaving me standing in the dim light again, alone with a decision I had not expected to face, and I told myself I would not call, that I did not belong in whatever world that number connected to, that tonight had been enough, more than enough. But even as the thought formed, it did not settle, did not feel certain, because deep down, something had already shifted, something that made it impossible to pretend I had not seen what I saw, felt what I felt, and as I slipped the card back into my pocket, my fingers lingering for just a second longer than necessary, I realized that the hardest part was not what had happened inside that restaurant. It was what might happen next, because for the first time in a long time, I was not sure I wanted things to stay the same. I told myself I would go straight home, that I would not think about it anymore, that whatever had happened inside that restaurant belonged to a different version of me, one that made decisions I did not usually make. But the moment I started walking, I knew that was not true, because every step felt heavier than it should have, like I was carrying something invisible with me, something that would not stay behind no matter how far I went. The street was quieter than usual, the kind of late night silence that made every sound feel sharper, the distant hum of traffic, the soft echo of footsteps that might have been mine or someone else's, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me, not because it was cold, but because something in me felt exposed in a way I could not explain. I reached the corner where I usually turned left toward my apartment, a path I could walk without thinking, a routine so familiar it felt automatic. But tonight I slowed down, my steps hesitating for just a second too long, because my mind was not on the street, it was still back there. In that moment where everything had shifted without warning, I stopped completely, my breath visible in the faint glow of a streetlight above, and without meaning to, my hand moved to my pocket, finding the card again, tracing its edges through the fabric like I needed to confirm it was still real, still there. I pulled it out slowly, holding it up just enough to catch the light, the name staring back at me like it carried more weight than it should, Adrian Voss, the letters clean, precise, the number beneath it simple, direct, and I wondered, not for the first time, what would happen if I called, not in some dramatic way, not expecting anything immediate, but in that quiet, dangerous way that comes with knowing a single action can change everything. I shook my head slightly, almost laughing at myself. Because this was not who I was. I did not make calls like that. Did not step into worlds I did not understand. I stayed where things were predictable, where choices had clear outcomes, where people did not look at you like they were trying to decide what you meant to them. But the problem was, I had already stepped into it, already crossed that line without thinking, and now pretending I had not felt dishonest in a way I could not ignore. A car slowed as it passed me, its headlights cutting across the sidewalk, and for a second, I saw my reflection in the dark window, a version of myself that looked exactly the same as it had a few hours ago. Same jacket, same tired eyes, same routine waiting to be followed. But something behind that reflection had changed, something subtle but undeniable, and I realized that the hardest part was not deciding whether to call. It was accepting that the decision mattered, that this was not just curiosity, not just a moment I could dismiss. It was something that had already taken root. Something that would not go away just because I chose to ignore it. My phone felt heavier in my hand when I finally pulled it out, the screen lighting up in the darkness. Familiar, simple, safe. Everything about it grounded me in the world I understood. And for a moment, I just stared at it, my thumb hovering without moving. Because dialing that number would not just be an action. It would be an answer to a question I had not fully asked yet. I exhaled slowly, steadying myself, and before I could overthink it, before I could talk myself out of it again, I entered the number, one digit at a time, each one feeling louder than it should, more final than I expected. And when the last number appeared on the screen, I paused, my heart beating faster now, not from fear exactly, but from something sharper, something closer to anticipation. Like standing at the edge of something unknown and realizing you are about to step forward instead of back. I pressed the call button, and the sound of it connecting, that soft, distant ring, felt like the quietest and loudest thing I had heard all night. I almost ended it right then, almost told myself this was a mistake, that I should hang up and forget everything. But I did not move. I stayed, listening, waiting, my breath shallow, my thoughts louder than the silence around me. And then, just as I started to think no one would answer, the line clicked, and a voice, calm, familiar, unmistakable, came through. I was wondering when you would call. For a second, I forgot how to breathe, because I had not expected him to answer like that. Not immediately. Not as if he had been waiting. Not as if my call had been part of something he already anticipated, and my grip tightened around the phone, my fingers pressing into the edges like I needed something solid to hold on to. You knew I would call, I said, my voice quieter than I intended, but steady enough that it did not give away how fast my heart was beating. And there was a pause on the other end, not long, not uncertain, just enough to make it clear that he was choosing his words carefully. I knew you would not ignore it, he replied, his tone calm, the same controlled confidence I had heard earlier, and that answer settled into me in a way I did not expect, because it was not about him being certain of me. It was about him understanding something I had not fully admitted to myself yet, that this was not curiosity, not anymore. It was something deeper, something that would not let me walk away. I glanced around the empty street, suddenly aware of how exposed I was standing there, phone pressed to my ear, connected to a conversation that did not belong in the quiet normalcy of this place. I do not even know why I called. I admitted, because there was no point pretending otherwise, not with him, not after everything, and I heard the faintest shift in his breathing. Like he had expected that too. Yes, you do, he said simply. And that certainty made my chest tighten again, because he was right. I did know. I just did not want to say it out loud, did not want to give it weight by turning it into something real, something that could not be taken back. I exhaled slowly, steadying myself. Because tonight did not feel finished, I said finally, the words coming out softer than I expected, but clearer, more honest than anything I had said so far. And there was another pause, longer this time, but not uncomfortable, not empty. It felt intentional, like he was considering something beyond just my answer. Like this conversation mattered in a way I could not fully understand yet. You are right, he said after a moment, and something in his voice shifted, not dramatically, just enough to make me listen more carefully. It is not finished. And those words sent a quiet ripple through me. Not fear, not exactly, but awareness. Like I had stepped into something that extended far beyond this call. Far beyond the moment I had whispered at that table. I looked down at the pavement beneath my feet, The cracks in the concrete suddenly more interesting than the implications of what he was saying, because focusing on something small felt easier than facing something unknown. Then what is this? I asked, my voice lower now, more cautious, because I could feel the direction this was going, and I was not sure if I was ready for it. And his answer came without hesitation. This is the part where you decide if you walk away, he said, calm, direct, like it was the simplest thing in the world, like the choice was still mine to make. And for a second, I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it felt impossible. Walking away was no longer simple, not after everything, not after I had already taken steps I could not undo. And if I do not? I asked quietly, the question leaving my lips before I could stop it. And that was when the silence changed again, heavier this time, more deliberate, like something important was about to be said, something that would shift everything again. Then you step into my world, he said, his voice steady, controlled, but carrying something underneath it that I could not ignore, something that made the air around me feel thinner, sharper. And once you do that, Lily, it does not work the way your world does. And I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry, because I understood what he meant even without him explaining it further. This was not a situation I could leave halfway through, not something I could treat like a mistake and move on from. This was a line, clear and defined, and crossing it would change everything. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, letting the weight of that settle in, letting myself feel the full impact of what he was offering or warning. I was not sure which. You are not asking me to walk away, I said slowly, because the realization had just hit me, sharp and undeniable. And I needed to say it out loud to make sure I was not imagining it. No, he replied, without hesitation. I am giving you the chance to. And that difference, subtle but important, shifted something inside me, because it meant this was not about him pulling me in. It was about me choosing to stay, choosing to continue, choosing to step forward instead of back. And that made the decision feel heavier, more real, more mine than I expected. I opened my eyes again, staring down the empty street. That suddenly did not feel so empty anymore, because now it felt like a crossroads, like a point where everything could change depending on what I said next. And my grip on the phone tightened slightly as I took a slow breath, realizing that whatever I chose in this moment, there would be no pretending it did not matter, no going back to before, just forward into something I could not fully see yet, something I was already closer to than I had ever intended to be. I could feel the answer forming before I said it, not in words, not yet, but in the way my grip on the phone steadied instead of shaking, in the way my breathing slowed instead of racing, like something inside me had already made the decision and was just waiting for me to catch up. What happens if I stay? I asked, my voice quieter now, not uncertain, but careful, because I understood that this was no longer a conversation about curiosity. It was about consequence, and there was no immediate reply, just a brief silence that felt heavier than before, like he was measuring not just my question, but what it meant about me, about the direction I was already leaning toward. You stop pretending that tonight was an accident, he said finally, his tone even, controlled, but carrying something sharper beneath it, something that made it clear this was not a hypothetical answer. This was reality, and I swallowed, my gaze drifting down the empty street again. But it did not feel like an escape anymore. It felt like a boundary, something I was standing on the edge of, and then I pressed, because I needed to hear it, needed to understand the full weight of what I was stepping into before I moved forward, and his response came without hesitation this time. And then you learn how to see what others miss, he said. And something about that answer caught me off guard, because it was not what I expected. It was not about danger, not about control or power. It was about awareness, about the very thing that had pulled me into this in the first place. And that realization settled into me slowly, like a truth I had not considered until now. You think that is a good thing, I said, more to myself than to him. But he heard it anyway. It is necessary, he corrected calmly, and I could hear the difference in his voice, the certainty, the experience behind it. Like this was not something he had chosen either, but something he had learned to live with, something that had shaped the way he moved through the world. And I hesitated again, not because I did not understand, but because I was starting to, and that made it harder to ignore, harder to walk away from, because it meant this was not just about him, not just about his world. It was about something in me that had already responded to it without permission. "You are asking me to change everything," I said slowly, my voice steady but lower now, more grounded, because I could feel the weight of what I was saying, and there was a pause, longer this time, but not uncertain, not hesitant, just deliberate. "No," he said quietly. "I am asking you to stop pretending that you can stay the same." And those words hit differently, not like a demand, not like pressure, but like recognition, like he had seen something in me that I had been avoiding, something I had not wanted to name because naming it would mean accepting it. And I closed my eyes for a brief second, letting that settle, letting the truth of it move through me in a way I could not block, because deep down, I knew he was right. Tonight had already changed something, already shifted the way I saw things, the way I reacted, the way I chose, and pretending otherwise would not make it disappear. It would only delay what was already happening. I opened my eyes again, my focus sharpening as I looked down the street that no longer felt like a simple path home, but a choice I could either follow or leave behind. And I realized that fear was still there, but it was not the only thing anymore. There was something else too, something quieter but stronger, something that felt like clarity, like understanding, like a step forward instead of back. "If I stay," I said carefully, my voice steady now, no hesitation left in it, "I do it on my terms." And the silence that followed was different, not heavy, not tense, but measured. Like he was considering that, not dismissing it, not overriding it. And when he spoke again, there was something new in his tone, something that had not been there before, something close to approval, or at least acknowledgement. "Then you will need to define what those terms are," he said, calm and certain. And I nodded slightly, even though he could not see me, because that made sense, because that was the only way this could work, not by stepping blindly into something I did not understand, but by choosing how I entered it, how I navigated it, how I held on to who I was even as everything around me shifted. And for the first time since this started, I did not feel like I was reacting anymore. I felt like I was deciding, like I was taking control of something that had been moving around me without my permission. "Then I am not walking away," I said finally, the words landing with a quiet certainty that surprised even me. And on the other end of the line, there was a pause, just long enough to feel intentional, just long enough to make it clear that this mattered. And when he spoke again, his voice was steady, but there was something beneath it now, something that acknowledged the weight of what I had just chosen. "Then this is where it begins," he said. And as those words settled into the silence around me, I realized that the night had not just changed, it had become something else entirely, something that no longer belonged to chance, but to choice, and that made it more real than anything that had happened before. The line stayed quiet for a moment after he said that, not empty, not disconnected, just still, like something had settled into place between us that did not need to be rushed. And I realized that for the first time that night, I was not reacting to him. I was standing beside the decision I had just made, holding it steady instead of questioning it. "Then what happens now?" I asked, not out of uncertainty, but because I needed direction, something real to anchor this choice to. And I heard the faint shift of movement on his end, like he had turned slightly, like he was already moving through whatever world he existed in while still holding this conversation with me. "Now you go home," he said, and the simplicity of it caught me off guard, because it felt too normal, too grounded for something that had just shifted so much. "That is it?" I asked, unable to hide the slight disbelief in my voice, and I heard it then. The faintest hint of something different in his tone. Not amusement exactly, but something close. "That is it for tonight," he clarified, calm, precise, and I let out a slow breath I had not realized I was holding, my shoulders relaxing just slightly, because part of me had expected something immediate, something intense, something that would pull me further in right away. But instead, he was giving me space, time, something I had not expected but suddenly understood the importance of. "And tomorrow?" I asked, because I knew there was more. There had to be, and I was not ready to pretend otherwise. Not anymore. Not after everything we had just said. And this time, his pause was shorter, more defined, like he had already decided the answer before I asked the question. "Tomorrow you start paying attention," he said, and the words were simple, but they carried weight, the kind of weight that made it clear this was not a suggestion. It was a shift in how I was supposed to exist moving forward. "To what?" I pressed, because I needed clarity, needed something more concrete than that. And his response came just as steadily. To everything you used to ignore. And that answer stayed with me longer than anything else he had said, because it did not require me to step into his world immediately. It required me to change how I saw my own, how I moved through it, how I noticed the details I had trained myself to overlook, and I could feel it already. The way my senses had sharpened tonight, the way I had picked up on things that most people would have missed, the way I had trusted that instinct without fully understanding it. And if I missed something, I asked quietly, because the thought lingered, the idea that this was not something I could perfect overnight, that mistakes were still possible, and his answer was immediate, unwavering. Then you learn, he said, and there was no judgment in it, no warning. Just a statement of fact that felt strangely grounding. Because it meant this was not about being perfect, it was about being aware, about growing into something I had not fully defined yet. I nodded slowly, even though he could not see it, because it made sense in a way I could not argue with. And for a second, neither of us spoke again, the silence settling into something more natural now, less charged, less uncertain, like we had moved past the moment of decision into something steadier, something that could actually continue. You are not what I expected, he said then, his voice quieter, more reflective, and I blinked slightly, caught off guard by the shift in tone, by the fact that he was sharing something that felt more personal than anything else he had said so far. I do not know what you expected, I admitted, my voice soft but honest, because I truly did not, and there was a brief pause before he answered, like he was choosing how much to say. Someone who would hesitate longer, he said finally. And that made something in me shift again, not in fear, not in doubt, but in recognition, because I had hesitated, just not in the way he meant, not in the way that would have kept me safe. And I let out a small breath, a quiet acknowledgement of that truth. I did hesitate, I said. I just did not stop. And for a second, there was nothing on the other end of the line, no response, no immediate reply, just silence. But it did not feel empty. It felt considered, like he was taking that in, measuring it, understanding it in a way I could not fully see. And when he finally spoke again, his voice had returned to that steady, controlled calm I was beginning to recognize. That is the difference, he said, and something about the way he said it made it clear that this mattered more than I realized, that this was not just a comment, it was an observation that would shape what came next, and I stood there under the dim streetlight, phone still pressed to my ear, feeling the quiet weight of everything that had just been set into motion, knowing that tomorrow would not look different on the surface, the same streets, the same job, the same routine, but underneath it, something had changed, something that would not let me move through it the same way again, something that would make me notice, question, and understand things I had never paid attention to before. And as the call ended with a soft click, leaving me alone in the quiet night once more, I realized that this was not the kind of beginning that came with noise or urgency. It was the kind that settled in slowly, quietly, until one day you realized you were no longer the same person who had stood at that corner wondering what would happen if you made a call. Because now, I already knew. It had already begun. The next morning did not feel like a new beginning. It felt like a continuation, like the night had simply stretched forward into daylight without ever really ending. And I noticed it immediately. Not in anything dramatic, not in anything obvious, but in the way the world felt sharper, clearer, like someone had adjusted the focus on everything around me without asking permission. The sound of my alarm clock seemed louder than usual, the faint hum of the city outside my window more distinct, the light filtering through the blinds cutting across the room in clean, defined lines instead of blending into the background like it always had. And I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that nothing had changed, that this was just another morning, just another shift waiting for me. But the thought did not settle the way it used to. It felt incomplete, like I was leaving something out on purpose. I sat up slowly, running a hand through my hair as I reached for my phone, half expecting to see something new, a message, a missed call, anything that would confirm that last night had not just been something I imagined. But there was nothing, just the same screen, the same notifications that had nothing to do with what I was thinking about. And for a second, that grounded me, made everything feel normal again, until I remembered what he said, pay attention. And suddenly, normal did not feel the same anymore. I moved through my routine on autopilot, getting dressed, grabbing coffee, stepping out into the street where the city was already awake, already moving. But instead of blending into it the way I always had, I found myself watching, noticing things I would have ignored before. The way a man paused too long at a crosswalk without crossing. The way a car idled at the curb with no one getting in or out. The way two people standing near a storefront were not really talking, just waiting. Their eyes scanning more than their words revealed. And it was not paranoia. It was clarity, like I was seeing layers that had always been there, but had never mattered to me until now. I reached the restaurant earlier than usual, pushing the door open and stepping into the familiar space that suddenly felt slightly different, not changed, just more defined. The sounds clearer, the movements sharper, the patterns easier to read. And I caught myself scanning the room the same way I had the night before, not out of fear, but out of instinct. And that realization made something settle in my chest, something that felt both unfamiliar and strangely right. "You look like you did not sleep," my coworker said as she passed by, her tone casual, her attention already moving on to something else before I could respond. And I almost smiled, because she was right, but not in the way she thought. It was not exhaustion, it was awareness. It was the way my mind refused to shut off, refused to go back to the version of things I had accepted before. I tied my apron slowly, my fingers brushing against the pocket where the card still rested, and the contact was enough to remind me that this was not just a shift in perspective. It was something real, something connected to a person, to a choice I had made that was still unfolding. The day moved forward like any other, orders coming in, customers filling seats, conversations blending into background noise. But underneath it all, I could feel it, the difference, the way I noticed small inconsistencies, subtle shifts in tone, the way someone hesitated before answering a simple question, the way another avoided eye contact just a second too long. And none of it was alarming, none of it demanded action, but it mattered, in a way I could not fully explain yet. And then, sometime in the late afternoon, just as the rhythm of the day had settled into something steady, something predictable again, the door opened. And I felt it before I saw him. That same quiet shift in the air, that same presence that did not need attention to command it. My gaze lifted without thinking, drawn to the entrance like it had been the night before. And there he was, Adrian, standing just inside the doorway, not moving yet, just observing, just taking in the room with that same calm, controlled awareness I was only beginning to understand. And for a second, everything else faded again, not because it stopped, but because it no longer mattered in the same way, because now, I knew what I was looking at, and more importantly, I knew that he was not here by accident. Not today, not after everything that had been set into motion. His eyes found mine almost immediately, not searching, not questioning, just certain, like he had expected this moment, like this was the next step in something that had already begun. And as I stood there, tray in hand, heart steady but aware, I realized that paying attention was only the beginning. Because now, I was part of what I was seeing, not just an observer anymore, and that changed everything. For a moment, neither of us moved, and it felt like the entire room existed somewhere behind us instead of around us, like the sound of glasses and voices had been pushed to the edges while something quieter, more deliberate took its place. And I realized that this was different from last night, not because the situation had changed, but because because this time I was not reacting without understanding. I was seeing it as it happened, the patterns, the small details, the way his presence shifted the space without effort. Adrian took a few steps forward, not rushed, not hesitant, just controlled, like every movement had already been decided before it happened. And I stayed where I was, not frozen, not unsure, just aware of the distance between us, aware of the eyes that noticed him without staring, aware of the quiet adjustments people made without realizing they were doing it. And when he stopped in front of me, close enough that the noise of the restaurant felt distant again, I did not look away this time. I held his gaze, steady, grounded, and for the first time since this started, I did not feel like I was standing in his world uninvited. I felt like I had stepped into it with intention. "You are paying attention," he said, his voice low, not a question, just an observation, and I nodded slightly, because there was no point denying it. Not when it was true in a way I could not ignore. "It is louder than I expected," I admitted, my voice calm but honest. because that was the closest way I could describe it, the way everything stood out now, the way nothing blended into the background the way it used to, and something in his expression shifted, not surprise, not approval, something quieter, like recognition, like he understood exactly what I meant without needing more explanation. "It gets quieter," he said, and that caught me off guard, because it felt like the opposite of what I was experiencing, and I frowned slightly, not in confusion, but in curiosity. "How?" I asked, because I wanted to understand, not just follow, and his answer came without hesitation. "You learn what matters and what does not," he said, and I let that settle, because it made sense, because even now I could feel the difference between noise and meaning, between movement and intention, between what looked important and what actually was, and I realized that this was not about stepping into chaos. It was about learning how to navigate it without being overwhelmed, without losing yourself in it. And that realization grounded me more than anything else had so far. He glanced briefly around the room, not scanning, not searching, just acknowledging it, like he was aware of everything without needing to focus on any one thing for too long. And then his attention returned to me, steady, direct. "You chose to stay," he said. And there was no pressure in it, no expectation, just a statement that carried weight because it was true, because I had made that choice knowing it would change things. And I met his gaze without hesitation this time. "I chose to see." I corrected quietly, because that was what it felt like, not just staying, not just stepping into something unknown, but choosing to understand it instead of ignoring it. And for a second, there was silence again, but it was not the same as before. It did not feel heavy or uncertain. It felt balanced, like two sides of something meeting in the middle. And then, just slightly, his expression shifted again. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me to see it, because I was paying attention now, because I knew what to look for. "That is more dangerous," he said, his voice calm, but carrying something underneath it, something that made the words settle deeper than they should have. And I felt a small breath leave me, not fear, not hesitation, just awareness, because I understood what he meant, that seeing things clearly meant you could not unsee them. That understanding came with responsibility whether you wanted it or not, and I nodded slowly, accepting that, not rejecting it, not stepping back from it, because it was already part of me now, already shaping the way I moved through the world. And for a moment, neither of us spoke again. The quiet between us steady, intentional, like it did not need to be filled, and then he reached into his jacket again, not quickly, not unexpectedly. Just a simple movement that mirrored the one from the night before, and placed something on the table beside me. Not a card this time. Something smaller, something that caught the light differently, and I looked down at it, then back up at him, my expression questioning without words, and he met my gaze, calm, certain. "You will know when to use it," he said. And there was no explanation beyond that, no instruction. Just trust, or something like it. Something that assumed I would understand when the time came. And before I could ask anything more, before I could even decide what I wanted to say, he stepped back, creating that same distance again, not leaving entirely, but shifting the moment forward. And as he turned slightly, his voice reached me one last time, quiet but clear. "You did not just change one night," he said. "You changed what comes after it." And as those words settled into the space between us, I realized that this was not an ending, not even close. It was something else entirely, something that had already taken root, something that would continue whether I was ready for it or not. And for the first time, I did not question it. I just stood there, aware, steady, and ready to see what came next.